Hey everyone, today I spoke with Dr. Mike T. Nelson. He's been on the podcast many times before. He is one of the smartest people in the area of exercise and fitness that I know. He's not only a PhD and an academic and has published, but he also trains himself and works with clients. He has a very broad perspective that he's bringing to this conversation about how to help me recover from a recent bout of overtraining. So we're going to go through the gamut of what is overtraining, how do you know if you might be exercising too much, what are some of the early indicators, what are the mistakes that I made, one of which was always having my heart rate in too narrow of a zone, also not eating enough. There's so much here to learn. You'll see my data in terms of my heart rate, what my workouts look like, what my sleep looked like, and then what were some of the symptoms that I was suffering with when my overtraining began, and how have I learned to better recognize the early warning signs of overtraining. I'm hoping that at this point you've heard so much of the conversation we've been having about the powerful impact exercise exerts on multiple systems of your body, and therefore you are exercising. But it's not a more is better sort of endeavor, which I've recently painfully learned. So learn from my mistakes, enjoy this conversation with myself and Dr. Mike T. Nelson on training, how to prevent and recover from overtraining. Hey everyone, special treat today. Mike Nelson is back to help us, myself included, figure out how to not grind oneself down with exercise as I recently did. Mike, you're really my go-to guy on this stuff because, as I've said before in the podcast, you really do a great job of balancing the academics and then applying those with clients that you work with. And it's a nice balance where you're not just genetically gifted and you can get away with, really shoddy approaches. You're pretty steeped in both sides of the spectrum. So it's always good to chat with you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And it's, do enough stuff for many years to get a little better at it. And like you said, a lot of it is just my own selfish kind of need to figure out, what can I do better? And then apply that with other people too.
Right. Well, let me kick us off with maybe a short backdrop. We covered this on a previous episode, but just the long short is I was making some really nice progress. And then all of a sudden, like Icarus, I flew too close to the sun and crashed and burned. And with the importance that we've been placing on exercise lately on the podcast, I'm sure a lot of our audience is probably doing more, appreciating that, gosh, a whole lot can be improved, whether it's your IBS, your IBD, your insomnia, your depression, maybe an issue with skin, if you're exercising more, if you're challenging your body. But there is a need to be able to recover and balance the progress on the one hand with recovery on the other. I know you know this, but just, to frame it for our audience. Maybe I can start with just running you through what I was doing, and then we can use it as a jump off point. Okay. Because I want to try to give, especially our audience, some specifics. So let me share my screen. I tried to compile notes that hopefully make some sense. So I was doing 3 days cardio, 3 days weights, and Monday, Wednesday, Friday, this is what essentially I was doing. AM cold tank, 3 to 5 minutes, 40 degrees, weights for 45 to 60 minutes with a CrossFit-like intensity. And I mean, I'm defining that via my own metric, but my heart rate averaged about 132 BPMs, which you can see. This is just one workout using my Garmin watch. 40 minutes, 132 beat per minute average. And then I would do a sauna session in the evening, about 50 minutes. As you can see, my average heart rate is 107. The temperature is about 200 degrees. And then on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, again, AM cold tank, I would do a mountain bike session for about 50 minutes. Zone 2, which I think may have been actually a little bit too high of a BPM, but my BPM was 142 beats per minute. I'm 39, so that does put me in the range from the Maffetone method, but again, it may have been too high. And then I'd finish that off with a 30-second all out, 30-second recover kind of Tabata run. And here you see my mountain biking. I'd bike about 12 miles in about 50 minutes at an average speed of about 15 miles per hour, average heart rate 142. I'd finish that off with a run. This again, average BPM about 142. And then there's the sauna. I've got some notes about vocational workload and other contexts, but maybe I'll pause here for a second in terms of anything here that you think is worth, commenting on, discussing, telling me I shouldn't have done. it's too intense or whatever.
Yeah. So one method I've been using for a couple of years now, that it's just sort of an anecdotal thing. You look at enough data and you see patterns. And I also work part-time for the guys over at Rapid Health. So Dan Garner and Andy Gelpin and Barbell Shrug crew. So I get to see a lot of pretty high-end athlete data that comes through them, whether it's a Whoop device, Aura, and they've got just a whole plethora of tons of stuff there. So I'm looking at visible stressors with them. And the one thing that I always look at right now that jumps out is just average heart rate of sessions. And what you'll see this in you'll see this in people like yourself. You'll see this in people who do primarily weight training. You'll see this also in aerobic athletes. The first thing that jumps out to me is if they stay in the same heart rate zone, my first thought is, especially if they're doing weight training and they're doing cardiovascular stuff. So that's telling me that their weight training is becoming more like a Metcon. And their other stuff is kind of they're stressing the system in kind of the same area. Now, of course, weight training is different than, biking. You get into mechanisms, all that kind of stuff. But generally, I like to see if you're doing weight training, unless it's a Metcon on purpose, then heart rate average should be a little bit lower. Zone 2 stuff, I think you're correct that you're probably more zone 3-ish there, which doesn't sound like a huge difference. But if you start adding time in there, I've noticed a big difference between zone 2 versus zone 3. Yeah. So a good rough metric for people listening, they're like, zone what? I don't even know what he's talking about. Zone 2, the high end, the old school, what they call the talk test, is pretty good. So if you're doing zone 2 training, you're on a bike, you should be able to have a relatively easy conversation with someone. Now, they may hear it and they may realize that you are doing exercise, but you should be able to finish all your sentences. You shouldn't be like, and then, like you shouldn't be gasping for air. You should be able to have a conversation. And that's actually a pretty good marker for kind of the high end of what would be a zone 2, more recovery-based work.
Yeah, I mean, a number of things there that resonate with me. One of the stupid mistake I was making was, if I'm getting all these calories on the mountain bike ride, because I would notice, right, before I up the intensity of my weights, I would look at how many calories am I burning from the weight training session? How many am I getting from the mountain bike session? It was like, wow, I was getting 300, let's say, from the weights when I was going less intense. And I was getting like 700 from the cycling. So I just said, well, what if I push harder during the weights and try to keep my heart rate higher, and maybe that will have an even more favorable impact on body composition. But as you're making your comments, I'm also imagining or remembering myself on the bike, hearing that same recommendation to make sure you could have an easy conversation, and thinking, I'm above that. Like, like I'm clearly breathing. Like I would have to really focus on my breathing to try not to let my heart rate skirt even higher up. And there was no room for talking with, my breathing. So yeah, the whole thing about being in one gear all the time being problematic makes a lot of sense. And one of the things that Eric Hinman had said when he was on the podcast was you can run, as one example, a 5K to determine what your max heart rate is. If you do a 5K all out, that should give you what your max heart rate is. And then from there, you can do a percentage calculation to determine what your zone 2 should be. It's a little more involved. I like your simple, recommendation, but do you think for people who are a bit more analytical, type A, who kind of need specific data, that test or a different one can help people target their zone 2 and not make the mistake that I did, which is going perceivably in zone 2, but kind of being right on the border of zone 3?
Yeah, so the old school thing that people hear all the time, like 220 minus your age will tell you your max heart rate. And
Yeah.
that formula was never really designed for that. It's just been used for that. And if I remember right, I'd have to pull the original study, but I want to say the standard deviation was like plus or minus around 17, which
Mm,
means that up to a very high difference between the low end and the high end. So as an average, yeah, like you take a whole population data, will that get you somewhat close? Yeah. At an individual level, what I've seen is huge variation with that. Like when I was in the lab, we'd do, hundreds of exercise phys tests, and we'd have young students in their 20s. Some of them would hit a high heart rate of like 230, which isn't supposed to be even possible. Some, their max would be 185, so we just saw a huge variation. So I agree
right.
with what he said. Like what I do in practice is until I've shown otherwise, I want to see you hit a max heart rate. And that is going to be your quote, true max until you do something that surpasses it. Right. So in practice here, I would have people come out and do like, I would do car pushes because I wanted something that wasn't going to take forever. A lot of the athletes I trained weren't good at running, but I needed something that was relatively hard. Now I'll just use a rower, which works pretty good. So let's say you hit 190 and that was like balls out, like you're, RPE 9.5, 10, like that was the most you could go. So until we can show otherwise, 190 is your max. Don't use a calculation at all. Use your actual data, and then we'll take the zones from there. Now, if you so happen to hit 193 on some day, cool, 193 is your new max. But 187, nope, your max is probably still 190. So just
Right.
by doing that, like finding what your true max is and taking percentages off that, you'll get relatively close by doing it.
Yeah. The one thing that I didn't love was, I don't know, 5K all out. That's a lot of work. So
Yeah, it's horrible. At
are
least for
you
me.
fine? Yeah, no, totally. And I don't mind, but picturing that, it's like, this is a pretty high bar. And I was wondering, would there be a lower barrier to entry? So what are you finding, would be an acceptable interval to assess your peak heart rate to calculate from?
Yeah, it depends. But I would say in general, 3 to 8 minutes of exercise, maybe. So for what I do in practice, 12-minute Cooper run test, I'll take their max heart rate off of that. By definition, take 12 minutes, see how far you can run. That'll also give you a relative calculation of their VO2 max. If they're not runners, I will use the Concept 2 rower. I'll have them do a 2K on there, set it for 2,000 meters, go as hard as you possibly can. And then I'll have them put a heart rate strap on. The opticals on a lot of the watches are delayed. So you may get vast underreporting on some of those. So I want to make sure they actually have a heart rate strap on, which they can pair to their watch. That's fine.
That's a good tip. Okay.
Yeah, the new optical ones are not too bad. And if you hold a high heart rate long enough, some of them will actually pick it up. But I've done this where I've compared my old Garmin Phoenix to the heart rate strap and without. And I would be off by like 30 beats per minute on the high end on some stuff very easily. And there's literature to support that too. So do 2K on the rower, take their max heart rate from there. Both of those will work pretty good. What I like about that is you get a VO2 max score from both of them. I get their max heart rate. And then if I want to go the extra step, I'll do a 2-minute heart rate recovery test at the end. So the second you're done, what is that max heart rate you were at? And then just breathe, don't move. And then after 2 minutes, what is your heart rate? I want to get fancy, I can look at a 1-minute interval too. So that'll tell me my parasympathetic recovery. And that is a marker also looking at overtraining, overreaching, that kind of stuff.
And while we're on VO2 max, one of the things I like about the Garmin Phoenix that I wear is it will calculate your VO2 max. I've heard some criticisms that if you're not doing more of a maximal exertion, the algorithm's not super accurate, which
Correct.
would make a lot of sense to me, because if you're trying to assess VO2 max and you're doing a moderate effort, then there has to be a lot of calculation, therefore a lot of variability, therefore a lot of opportunities for inaccuracies. So you're liking either the 12-minute Cooper run or what it was a 2K row all out to get your VO2 max. And I'm assuming you want to use the heart rate strap but I don't know if will the Garmin do that if you're using an external device?
Yep. So all you have to do is you have to set up the Garmin to pair it. And once you set it up in there, it'll actually default to the chest strap.
Yeah,
so
which is what mine currently does. I just wasn't sure if that would throw off their sort of algorithm if it was using an external device. That's great to know.
Yeah, because you want to calculate, you want an accurate heart rate, because otherwise, yeah. And that's what I've seen with people. The first question I'll ask them is, did you ever pair it to a chest strap? And they're like, no. And then they're probably, the device has never seen that really true max. So their VO2 max is kind of getting squashed a little bit low in some cases.
Yeah. And that's what I noticed, because my VO2 max was a 45. In fact, before that, it was a 42, which isn't terrible, but for my level of fitness, I felt like that was fairly low, but I was doing it based upon a 5K, and it was a 5K in zone 2. So, okay, noted on both of these. Okay, so coming back to, let me share my screen again, because I wanted to pepper in a few other things.
I got a few other notes too for you.
Okay, on this before we move, or unpack.
No, just on your notes or your screen. So
gotcha. Okay, so the next section I wanted to go to was some of the vocational and kind of other stress. But before we go there, was there anything I missed that you wanted to comment on, or are you good?
Yeah, so a couple things. So what you did with the weight training is incredibly common. So as a general rule of thumb, I tell people, don't look at any calories calculated from your damn watch. One, they're not very accurate. Two, I did this for a period of time. When the watches came out, I was like, oh, this is cool. What if we just have everybody eat to what the calories say on their device? This will be amazing. Calories in, calories out. People get shredded. Their performance will be great. Woohoo! We solved all the world's issues. Yeah, it failed miserably, as you could figure out.
Living proof of that.
Right. So the watch isn't super accurate. And then what it does is it prioritizes people's brains to consciously and unconsciously just drive to burn more calories. Right. And so if you back up and you look at, okay, what is the reason for weight training? Yes. Do you burn calories? Yes. But number one, you probably want to get stronger for performance. And two, you want to have some stimulus to add muscle or hypertrophy. The ironic part is, to get stronger, you then need to rest more completely in order to perform your next set. So we would see an average heart rate would be a little bit lower. Sometimes it will spike up. Yes. Doing, high rep dumbbell rows, whatever. But I want it to actually come back down, and then once you've recovered, then go again. So keeping in mind, what is the goal of that?
Then Mike, how do we reconcile that with, if I look at CrossFitters who are doing Metcons, they seem to be in pretty awesome shape. So what there am I not understanding or accounting for?
Generally, if you're watching them on TV or videos, you're looking at the freaks, number one. So number one, you're looking at the output of, in some cases, decades of training, right? The output of a high-level CrossFit, you're graded primarily on a Metcon ability. But most of those people, both guys and women, are very strong. And almost all of them spent a base of 2, 3, 4, 5, 8, 12 years of lifting just to get stronger. And then they're able to do it in more of a cyclic fashion. Right. If your max back squat is 135, you're probably not going to be very, very good at a lot of CrossFit Metcons. Right. So you want to get your max strength higher, and then you can translate that into a Metcon or making that kind of more of a cyclic work. And then that gets into all sorts of crazy theories about top level CrossFit people and, do their muscles actually occlude or not occlude, and all sorts of weird mechanistic stuff too.
Okay. Well, that's fair. I mean, the way I would interpret that in part is you're seeing people with great genetics, and then B, what they're doing at the gym or at CrossFit or during competition may not be what they've done to get up to the point of being able to pinnacle with that output during a competition.
Yeah, because if you're going to the games, you are primarily graded on your ability to do Metcons. So if you're strong enough and your strength is like super high, then working on Metcons is the specific thing is going to make you better.
Right.
But some of the lower level people I've worked with, like I can look at their strength numbers and be like, yeah, you might be able to get there, but it's going to be 2 to 3 years of doing some aerobic stuff, very few metcons, and mostly like maximal strength and a little bit of hypertrophy work, just because your maxes are hundreds of pounds sub max of the people doing what you want to do. Right. And that process, it just takes years.
Yeah. All right. That makes sense. And sorry, I cut you up, but what else were you saying?
That's
if
right.
I didn't interrupt?
And to me, like a metcon adaptation is kind of like its own thing, right? Because there's always this debate of, oh, well, if I need to get more aerobically fit, can I just lift weights faster? Kind of. You just get a different thing, in my opinion. That is its own specialty. Is it hard? Yes. Do you burn a lot of calories? Yes. Do you see some increase in aerobic? Yes. The hard part is if you're not trained in that area and you don't already have a high VO2 max or a high aerobic base, I've seen that just absolutely crispy people super fast.
Yeah. I mean, case in point, it felt great. I have to say, I would go to the gym and feel like I was outworking everybody there. But
oh, sure.
I guess you can only do that so long, right?
Yeah. And my bias with that is most people, I want to put them on a device that's automatically going to give me their output. So doing a barbell metcon is harder because you don't know exactly how much work you did. Where when I start people on it, I'll usually put them on a bike or a rower. One, because it's hard. And two, on a rower like Concept 2, I sound like I'm a shill for Concept 2, you automatically get time, distance, and power. So now we can track one session to the next of, okay, how much work did you actually do? Because a common thing when you're doing true high intensity is people are like, oh my God, I'm seeing, white buffaloes in the sky. This is like the hardest session ever, which it felt that way. But if you monitor their progress over times, a lot of times their effort is going up and the result in what they're physically capable of doing is going down. And so that's like a trend of like, something's going on.
Yeah. I that was one of the first things in the back of my mind I noticed. I wasn't sure how to account for it. I thought, I had some travel or a bad night's sleep.
Sure.
Maybe that's why I'm taking a little bit off the bar in terms of weight. So obviously you've been doing this a while because you're able to pick out all my mistakes pretty easily.
Yeah. And they're pretty common. Like I've done them all.
Yeah. All right, let me bring us back to the notes. So the other thing that I'm wondering about, and I did see this there's a few papers that we reviewed looking at overtraining, overreaching, and a high cognitive demand was one of the things that I was interested to see can accompany overtraining. So yes. I wanted just to share this really quick in terms of I work about 35 hours per week, and I should clarify, this is actual work. And I think if anyone tracks their actual work, they'll appreciate that 35 hours is actually a lot of work, especially if, as I've denoted here, it's all high cognitive demand. Like almost none of what I do is easy because all those things have now been given to someone on our team so that I can do these other things. And it's just kind of when you're in the head of an organization, that's what ends up happening. So some of the easy things that I used to enjoy, other people are doing. And now I'm always getting hit with a research brief or a really hard problem. So it's a lot. And this, this is just 1 week using Timular. I had a even higher than normal week, 41 hours of work output. And again, if I'm eating lunch or, going outside and doing a phone call as a break for 10 minutes, the timer stops. So, this is what a week may look like. 6 hours, 8 hours, 4 hours, 7 hours, 3 hours, and maybe another hour or two on Sunday. So right now it's 7 days per week. That's not my forever goal, but there's a decent amount there. I wouldn't say stress is high. I'm not like, oh my God, there has been a few periods where there have been shit hitting the fan, times that were stressful, but it's more so just a lot of cognitive demand. But this was one of the things, again, that stuck out to me in terms of what can underlie and kind of be a antecedent to overtraining. I'm assuming you've seen this also, but for people who are trying to balance these couple of variables, what thoughts or comments or cautions should people be aware of?
Yeah, I mean, at a base level, like all stress is stress, so to speak, whether that's psychological stress, work stress, physical stress. There are different ways your body deals with it. But it's just like if I'm, trying to fill this glass, whatever capacity that is, and I'm adding stress to it, which is water, at some point I just can't fit any more in there. Different people will have different things that their body responds to more stressful than other things. But I've looked at, pretty high level athletes who generally a lot of times tend to have high cognitive stuff going on, not necessarily elite level athletes. People who do a lot of, high level executives. And I mean, my little hypothesis over the years is I think high cognitive output stuff, the max, I think, is 4 to 6 hours a day. And I would say 6 hours a day routinely is on the extreme high end. Like this is in terms of something you could repeat day in and day out. Could you do periods of time where it's higher? Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I do think that adds to it. Now, whether the person feels that it's stressful or not, that's different. So the two things I've noticed is like just the total time doing high cognitive stuff and then also task switching. So by definition, most people who are doing, high 4 to 6 hours are probably not task switching, which is good. I see some people have the inverse problem where I don't really know if they did any high cognitive output stuff all day, but all they did is just switch tasks back and forth and they don't get a lot of productivity and they're fried also.
And that's maybe just a quick aside opportunity. There's a great book by Cal Newport called Deep Work. And long story short with that book, which I would highly recommend for anyone trying to optimize their high cognitive output, is task switching carries a very high cost and it's really probably not worth it. So the way I try to set up my day, and you can see this, let me get my screen share up again here. So when I'm timing myself, you can see the bars indicate the different tasks. And so I try to really group or consolidate to one task. And the tracker, I use Timular. It's helpful because if I'm tracking, let's say, research and development as compared to podcasting, as compared to biz dev, as compared to, whatever it is, it gives you a mental audit of, ooh, do I really want to interrupt what I'm doing right now to respond to this email? And when you understand the cognitive load associated with task switching, that it decreases your performance, you rethink that impulse to stop doing this really hard thing and then respond to this email where a little thing came up that may require your attention. So anyway, if it helps people, read Deep Work, stop task switching, and try to just build into your day. The first 2 hours will be this. And then I'll open it up to maybe I have a litany of Slack messages or emails I have to check in on. I'll do that for 20 minutes, bing, 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 kind of, that pingy-pangy sort of thing. And then I'll go back to another deep task. That's what's worked well for me from a flow perspective. But just to throw that out there, again, in case it helps people.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, the biggest thing for me, I try to highly limit is email, social media, stuff where you have to respond one after the other. That's always different things.
Yeah.
That could be a whole podcast in and of itself.
Coming over to the nutritional piece on this, So nutrition, my weight decreased by about 4 pounds. I wouldn't say that was big. But I did notice, and this I think is also a tell that we pulled out from some of the ex-phys literature, my appetite started to go down. And at first I was like, yay, I've got all my stuff queued in where my satiation is where it should be with sleep and diet and exercise. And the more exercise I'm doing, it seems to be helping with my satiation signaling. So I'm eating less. Now I'm realizing this is one of the early indicators of overtraining.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I'll have athletes rate appetite, and in general, although it's counterintuitive, if their appetite feels like it's going up a little bit and their performance is good, again, depending upon what our goal is, if they're off season, then that's actually where I want them to be because we can just give them more food. If they're purposely trying to get leaner, then it gets a little tricky. You're kind of balancing stuff at that point.
Right. Right. And yeah, and this was, who is this from? I can't make out the author of this paper at this resolution on the screen, but this is from a journal, and there was a few things here that I thought were really telling. And, I've highlighted with the red circles the ones that I find interesting. Decreased caloric intake, changes in HRV, which I know you have done a lot of research in. Mm-hmm. The increase in body fat, this hit me like a ton of bricks. I don't think I gained much body fat, but there was kind of this peak where my body fat was at its lowest. And then I kind of got this sense, and this is all just subjective, but that I was losing a little bit of muscle and I was gaining a little bit of abdominal fat. It wasn't anything huge. It's hard to notice when you're looking at yourself every day, but seeing this reported in a ex-phys journal was helpful. Obviously, reductions in performance, and then a blunted cortisol awakening response, which we know that the cortisol rhythm should be high in the morning and low at night. And I think what happened with me was inversion, because my sleep went to absolute crap. And so I think all these things really played out in my case. But the caloric intake was one that I didn't really have on my radar screen.
Yeah, and the decrease in body fat, I think that's probably true on an average, and I have seen that on an individual level. I've seen it change the other way. And the tricky part about that is, like in the lab, like how do you actually measure it? I do generally see athletes that report it. And if we look at just pictures of them, a lot of times they look a little fuzzier, they hold more fluid, the scale weight may go up a little bit. Like I definitely see those types of, anecdotal reports.
Yeah, that makes sense. So maybe a way of just concluding on that would be, if you're overly catabolic, it's not going to be optimal for your body composition. Agree?
Yeah, disagree? And even then, like if you're overreached, are you truly catabolic? It's like a debate, right? Because what marker are you actually looking for it? And then I haven't found a study that's looked at actual protein breakdown related to it, probably because actually measuring protein breakdown in the lab is a big pain in the ass. But athletes who keep going down that path, right, that end up with decreased caloric intake and high stress, like they're definitely not doing themselves any favors.
Yeah. So then coming back to these notes one more time. Now, I wasn't tracking Aura for sleep the entire time. I started tracking it kind of mid-crash, but you can see that my sleep score got much better over time, and my HRV it also improved. So just some obvious things that you would expect to see, but to put them up there on the board, I really wish I had been tracking my Aura before, but I had gotten to a point where my sleep was pretty good. And I said, well, you know what? The Aura isn't telling me anything new at this point. So it didn't seem necessary to continue tracking it. In retrospect, I probably won't do that again, because even if I'm not looking to it for insights, I think just having it there to refer back to retrospectively in a situation like this would have been helpful. But there's my data on those two. Any thoughts on that, Mike?
Yeah, a couple of things on that. So most people, as they're kind of overreaching or kind of pushing the envelope a little bit too hard, most people generally will see sleep disturbances, but not everyone. I also look for the length of sleep. So I know for like myself, if I have the ability to just go to bed earlier and sleep a little longer, like I can get away with a lot more training, even at the same caloric input, same stress level, same everything else. And for me, I'm one of those weirdos where like ideally 9.5 hours in bed is like what I found works best.
You're a bear.
Yeah. So changes in that, you can definitely see that. Another thing that people don't use a lot on Aura that's extremely useful is the temperature. So if you're routinely seeing temperature increases above like 0.6, 0.7, 0.8, to me, that's reflecting that something's going on with your immune system. And the immune system can get triggered at the early onset of it also. So most of the time I will cross check that with like a seated HRV reading in the morning and see what those are doing. This is assuming that, they didn't have like, a huge meal right before they went to bed or something else that's causing that temp to go up. So, everything else is constant. And the last part too on Aura, it is very accurate for heart rate variability, but you're taking the average over the course of a night. And if you have a low resting heart rate, a lot of times you won't see slight changes in it. You can have what's called parasympathetic saturation, where your vagal tone at rest is so high, it's just kind of washing out a lot of these other stressors. So if somebody says, hey, my resting heart rate at night gets down to like the low 40s. I've got some clients where it's like, 38. Yeah, you probably aren't going to see a huge change in HRV. So doing a commanded measurement with a different system, or maybe Aura can do that in the future, seated or standing first thing in the morning, will be much better able to pick up small changes due to stress status day to day.
That's good to know. And that's something that I've fought you on doing. So maybe,
I know.
I'll get back in line. But the understanding of the why is also helpful. But I think you could also make a counter argument that now that I've learned, we've learned some of the early warning signs, I think it'll be easy to see this again. And that's actually, so that's what I want to pull up next is what happened to me symptomatically, because in retrospect, the breadcrumb trail leading up, it becomes much more obvious. So early stage,
always 2020.
Yeah, totally. Early stage, there was this hip flexor tightness, low back tightness. I'd notice if I had been sitting for a while and I'd get up, it kind of be one of these stretching. And I was like, man, where the heck is this coming from? I'm now realizing that was one of the few muscular manifestations of the overtraining. Another thing that was odd, but is also very well reported, was bowel issues. In my case, looser bowels. Nothing crazy, but just, hey, normally I'm a Bristol 3-ish, and now I'm noticing sometimes more often I'm having these looser bowels. And I thought, oh, maybe it's this new coffee, maybe it's this supplement that I'm trying. So it took me a little while, but again, now that I've learned my system, these things will be more queued up for me going forward. And my mood was kind of flat. I didn't have a whole lot of those peaks of excitement. And there's a name for this, Mike. Maybe you can help me out for it. It's when you move when you otherwise don't need to. Is it like spontaneous movements? There's definition.
NEAT, so non-exercise activity thermogenesis. There's also a subcomponent of that, which is the kind of the twitching or foot tapping or all these subconscious movements that you do.
Yeah.
And in general, when people get overreached, and also especially if you just whack a whole bunch of calories from them, a lot of those movements then stop because the body is like, whoa, hold on. We got to try to conserve some energy here. And we don't want to like keep, burning through this energy.
Right.
There's some old literature looking at what's called thrifty versus non-thrifty metabolisms and how people upregulate and downregulate to all this stuff too.
Right. Yeah. So part of the flat mood for me was just those little things where I might be walking down the stairs and sometimes I'm just like, whoa, just those little things that kind of manifest your personality, your vitality, your happiness. I was more just kind of going through the motions. That's early stage, little things that I noticed. And kind of mid to later stage, there was about a week, and I've noticed this once before, where I felt like I was high. I was just always on. It didn't matter if it was 9 in the morning, 9 in the evening. My mind was just going. I was sharp, and it feels good. But again, second time I've learned that's followed by a crash. The first time it happened when I was overdoing it with Wim Hof breathing, those hyperventilations, and then you exhale, hold as long as you can. And you can have these like mini passing out episodes because you're trying to hold your breath as long as you can. Super exhilarating. But I also noticed that same thing where I just felt sharp as a tack. And then about a week later, I crashed. And part of that crash was sleep got really bad. The workouts shifted where I found myself skipping weight training sessions and saying, I just want to do cardio. And I didn't have the drive to get under heavy weights, but I could do steady state cardio. I had some shoulder aches. And I also noticed that my voice was getting fatigued so easily. I had this incredibly high degree of raspiness that, like right now I'm 3 hours in. And so my voice is getting a little bit tired, but to me, that seems somewhat normal. This was just opening my mouth for 5 minutes and I'd notice a lot of vocal fatigue. So those were some of the symptoms that I noticed. And I share these for others so that you can start to figure out what might be some of your tells, because they're probably different for everyone. Like you were saying, Mike, not everyone may notice sleep. I feel like for me, it's more so sleep and maybe bowels than it is muscular. I didn't have much in the way of, injuries or aches or pains, but I'm assuming, again, it's probably fairly unique for each person.
Yeah, if you look at the literature, like in general, what you'll see in terms of progression. So there's all sorts of different words people use for it, right? So at the very, very end, like completely burnt out is what they call OTS or overtraining syndrome. Most people will probably never get there. Even high-level Olympic athletes can train crazy and not get there. However, it does happen, despite what the internet says. And if you're a high-level athlete and that happens to you, it could very well be the end of your career. Like you're going to be flat out not doing much of anything for not just weeks, but probably months or longer. The good part is most people probably don't ever get to that stage. The first stage would be considered a functional overreaching. That's kind of the common terms now. If you go for 2 weeks, you take 2 weeks off of just everything, and you are back to normal, your performance recovers, everything is good. In hindsight, you were probably functionally overreached. Now, some people may program that way on purpose to get some super compensation and some other things like that. If it takes 2 to 4 weeks, you're probably in what they call non-functional overreaching. Again, a lot of this is done in hindsight. So if you took 4 weeks off and you're kind of back to normal, in retrospect, you were probably what they call non-functionally overreached. And some of the symptoms you reported match a lot of the literature. You can go back to the mid-90s. Dr. Andrew Fry did a lot of super cool studies. One of them was he took Olympic weightlifters, brought them into the gym, and he took one group and said, okay, we're going to figure out what your 1 rep max is, the heaviest load you can do. And we're going to have you do that load or try to get as close to that load as you can every single day for 2 weeks in a row. The other group, just do like 50% of your 1 rep max. And they measured, all sorts of things, blood levels, cortisol, testosterone, urinary measures. And the things that kind of came out with it was, I think it was a 35% reduction in speed and power at the end of those 2 weeks, which if you're an Olympic weightlifter, that's pretty massive. So it was the speed and power component that dropped off first. I think there's some further studies looking at just average aerobic capacity, not like high-level aerobic capacity, but, zone 2, zone 3 type stuff. Didn't really drop off that much.
That's what
changes to testosterone and cortisol, it's debatable. I don't think there was probably any huge changes there. So how you get to what you're doing matters. Like if you look at some people that are more on the aerobic side and they're just doing a crazy number of miles and their volume is just dramatically high, you do tend to see more disruptions in different hormones and things of that nature too. Subclassification, some people will even say there's a difference in, sympathetically overreached to parasympathetically overreached. And what that means is like the little high you talked about, normally on HRV, what I'll see is their sympathetic stress gets a little higher, a little higher, a little higher. Most of the time they feel pretty good. Performance may be okay, but other things might start to happen. And then if that keeps going, what we'll see on their heart rate variability is it gets lower, it gets lower, it gets lower. And then all of a sudden, like they'll kind of implode at some point. They take some time off and they'll come back and recover.
Right.
I've seen a handful of cases where I've only seen 2 so far in like 15 years. One guy was so funny. He comes to me, he's like, my performance isn't very good. His lifestyle is like a floating trash bin fire. He's, snorting pre-workout before training. He's drinking like a liter of coffee a day. And he read that he has to do like, super high intensity beyond failure training. And
yeah,
we just start measuring his heart rate variability. I'm trying to tell him this is a really stupid idea. He's like, no, I'm going to do it. And he keeps doing it. So his HRV keeps going down and down and down and down. And then literally all of a sudden one day it goes ridiculously high. So he goes being from sympathetic to massively parasympathetic. And he's like, oh my God, I can't even make it to the gym. I'm just so tired. It's like your body has this sort of protective mechanism of saying, hey, you were getting away with it. You kind of got away with it. Yes, you're abusing stimulants, everything else. But at some point, I'm literally going to pull the plug out of your back and shut you down so hard that you are literally not going to do anything.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the lesson here that I think echoes is more isn't always better. And this is something in the clinic. We often talk about this with various GI treatments or whatever it may be. And it applies here too. And I'm right there with you, Mike, and everybody else in terms of the more is better can be really appealing. And I think this is why it's important to have these conversations. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's easy to measure, right? And a good buddy of mine, Adam Glass, has a phrase that I stole. That's more is not better. Better is better.
Yeah. I like that.
I know is kind of weird. So that's why I like people at first to quantify their training, even if it's resistance training. Like I may have sessions where my max output wasn't really that much. I didn't do that much more volume, but the movement felt better. Oh, okay, cool. So that's still an improvement, right? So a lot of times we think, well, if I didn't lift more, the session wasn't really that much better. And you are going to have one or two sessions that are off once in a while, but we're just looking for those trends that carry out over multiple days, multiple weeks. And then does it start to affect other lifts on other days where in theory, calories are good, HRV might be okay, or maybe not change much, sleep is good. There's no other rationale that it should be down. But if all those trends are kind of going down in multiple areas, then you're like, okay, something's going on here.
Yep. Yeah. No, it's simple. Like you said, in hindsight, these things are really simple to sort of pick out. This is a slide we made, by the way. This is not endorsed by Mike Nelson. Okay. So yeah, so that was what I wanted to go through in terms of the stage. There was a few things I wanted to pick your brain on that came up in terms of ways to preempt overtraining. There's one researcher that had some kind of high recommendations regarding carbs. Yeah, Bonilla, he recommends, the following regarding carbs, and, anywhere from 5 to 10 grams per kilogram per day. I mean, for me, that would have meant 900 grams of carbohydrate potentially, which seems a little high. I could get on board maybe with 600. I get where that comes from in terms of making sure that you're adequately fueled. But do you think this might be a little bit high in terms of the carb target?
The caveat is that's for very heavy endurance training. So that's for people running multiple miles day in and day out. In some of those groups, the theory is if you can get enough carbohydrates in, you may mitigate some of the symptoms of it. In my opinion, possibly yes, because especially that population are notorious for undereating. And especially if you're running, a lot of times they have GI issues. Biking's really not as bad. So your physical time windows you have to consume enough calories can be reduced if you're running, 1, 2, 3, sometimes 4 hours a day. Obviously, most people are not doing this every day. So that makes it a little bit trickier. I do think it's an issue. I don't think just magically having 900 grams of carbs will solve everybody's issue. But I do find that a lot of athletes, even people who strength train, and sometimes even general population, do tend to underconsume calories, whether on purpose or not on purpose. So I do find that, under fueling is definitely an issue.
Gotcha. Okay. So the other couple of things here, let me just cue up these visuals again, because I want to pick your brain on as much of this as possible. There's some supplements that I think might have promise. Although, I don't think supplements give you a get out of jail free card. So just to kind of lead with that, but they have some basics from what we pulled out: carb intake, protein intake, caloric intake, and sleep quality. Nothing there I think is incredibly novel. There's also some recommendations about cognitive effort, which you may not be able to try. And here are some of the supplements that I found interesting. So let me come to, I had a nice summary slide on this. Yeah. So here, ashwagandha, what I find interesting about this is it helps to adapt and normalize cortisol levels. And my thinking there is it may help, especially with sleep. If you're someone like me, for whom that seems to be one of your early symptoms, I wonder if ashwagandha might prevent insomnia associated with overtraining. Maybe if you're using it periodically, especially if you're going into kind of an overload phase for a month or 6 weeks, maybe that's when you want to be on the ashwagandha. And then when you deload, you come off of it. Any experience with that, Mike?
Maybe. I mean, the research I've seen on it is statistically significant. Is it super significant from what I've seen in terms of performance data in the real world? Nah, it's kind of mixed. Like, I've had some clients use that. I know you've got rosea on there also, and just adaptogens in general. Some people I know, I don't know why, they just respond better to them. Other people, I don't notice a huge effect, to be honest. So I just notice a lot of variability from one person to the next.
Sure. And I guess while this list is up on the screen, there's probably some simple things that can preempt some of the gut issues: probiotics, colostrum, glutamine. Again, would I think they're a get out of jail free card? No. Might they help buffer some of this stuff as someone's bumping up against overtraining? Perhaps. Phosphatidylserine, I also think, could be interesting, especially because that's been shown in some studies to help with or help to prevent or slow cognitive decline. It's a different population, but those are a few things that stuck out to me. But yeah, what here, Mike, you think is worthwhile? Maybe what do you think might be not worth really integrating?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of creatine monohydrate. The data related to overtraining, overreaching, maybe. But it just seems to have so many other benefits. I think it's probably just worth it anyway. 5 grams
Which
per day.
I would agree with. This slide is targeted toward overtraining, but I think Correct. As a supplement for general performance, I would say absolutely.
Yeah. Similar with beta alanine, maybe. Like, if you talk to Dr. Roger Harris, there's some, I think, more interesting research on beta alanine coming out in the future, maybe in terms of performance preservation, possibly. So for listeners, beta alanine combines with L-histamine to form intramuscular carnosine. So carnosine is a buffer of the hydrogen ions that get produced during a high-intensity exercise. Quercetin does have some interesting data for muscle recovery. Branched-chain amino acids, I'd say probably not. If you're going to use anything, use an essential amino acid. Where I find that can be useful is especially before, during, or after exercise. If people have issues with their gut just doesn't feel very good, they can't take in a lot of protein or have a meal around that time, especially if their training times are getting prolonged, 1, 2, 3 hours a day. I think essential amino acids can be beneficial for that. Beetroot juice, maybe, because of nitrates. Most of the data for that, for performance and recovery, is you're going to need a pretty damn high dose. It does get a little expensive. And then the other part too is don't use any mouthwash, because how they work is they have to be recycled through the mouth, actually. And the enzymes in the mouth are what actually convert it. And if you use mouthwash, there's a couple studies now showing you'll absolutely ameliorate any benefit from it. So if you're using that, don't use mouthwash at the same time. Thiamine, maybe. There's some other forms that have been proposed as beneficial for cognitive fatigue. Yeah, I'd say maybe. There's not too much data on that so far.
In general, are you finding supplements have, this give an arbitrary scale here, but a 10% impact, 25% impact, 50% impact as it pertains to overtraining, prevention, and or recovery?
Uh, Single digits, if that.
Yeah. Which is so important
Yeah.
for us to clarify because it's so easy to fall into the, well, let me just buy this thing and it's going to help me. And
Right.
I'm a victim of that same thing. I will buy
Everybody
a
is.
lot of stuff. If I can get more performance, I will gladly spend money. But I think for those who have to be choosy and or just to make sure that we're disclosing the level of benefit, it's really important to quantify that, because otherwise you just hear about all the it could help this, promises without the requisite context of the effect size.
Yeah, and I'm a big stickler of like the mechanistic data is interesting, right? So as researchers, you want to know like how does it work, and hey, like there's some stuff that does change cortisol. Cool. May that be helpful? Sure. If it's a high level athlete, you've done everything else. They're getting sleep, they're doing relaxation, they're doing breath work, blah blah blah. Yeah, might be worth throwing it in. But
Right.
to that level athlete, if they're a high level bobsled athlete, for example, like very, very small differences in performance, like have a huge effect on their career and potentially their ability to make, millions of dollars more, especially in professional sports. So even things we know have very solid data for performance, caffeine, creatine, some other things, they're still like single digit percentages, which again, to a high level athlete, that could be the difference between first and 12th place. To someone who's just starting to exercise, it's probably comes out in the wash.
Right. And also, if someone's on a budget, I think this is when the conversation's more important, because they might be looking at 4 supplements and that might equate to $300 a month. So, that swing for them may lead to some financial stress, which they may not want to pursue if they knew the degree of benefit that purchase would give them.
Yeah. A buddy of mine, Craig Keaton, said years ago, which I agree with, is that for most people, they would be much better off taking the $100 to $200 a month they spend on questionable supplements and just buying more food.
Yeah, or a sauna,
or a higher quality level of food.
Yeah, I'm a huge proponent of sauna just because of all the
sauna. Do something else.
Yeah, the benefits associated with that. Yeah. So, Mike, when you look at all this, it seems to me like there's a few obvious things for me to do. One, have planned recovery in my routine and not just go hard. Make sure I'm not always in that sort of heart rate gear of 140s. Be cognizant of the early signs of overtraining and get some more calories in, pull back on the volume, emphasize recovery. Those seem to be the biggest ones for me, but what else would you add as we're trying to kind of take my crash and burn and distill it down to a handful of lessons for our audience?
In your case, so people always ask like, okay, how long should I program training? When should I take a taper? When should I do a deload? And the longer I've been doing this, the more I actually kind of base that almost on their personality, which sounds really kind of woo-woo. So for someone like yourself, you would probably taper and deload 4 to 5 weeks and probably stay right around that cycle because you're kind of a psycho and you like to push stuff hard, and you could probably get away doing that if you've got a week of kind of buffer time, low time coming. And you also, there's some interesting mental stuff about knowing that that's coming up, right? Whether that's a feed forward mechanism, Noakes like central governor hypothesis, whatever. I've just noticed with those people, they do better with more planned of when it's going to happen, and then maybe pushing them a little bit high before and then kind of backing down and then starting over again. Some people, it's 8 to 12 weeks before I even program any type of taper or deload.
You're saying from the crash, it would be 4 to 5 weeks before getting back to a normal routine?
Just doing once you're back to normal, like how long would we program you to do kind of formalized stuff and push volume and intensity a little bit?
A cycle would be 4 to 5 weeks.
4 to 5 weeks, yeah.
And then
which is pretty short.
Yeah, and then you'd recover for what? Would it be like a week of sort of active recovery and then back to another cycle? Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
It's reasonable.
And then, and then during that week, generally what I like to do is cut volume, but leave intensity as much as we can. So you may go to the gym, you may still lift heavy, but you may only hit one high top set, and that might be it. And the rest of your stuff's pretty easy.
Right.
So if you were normally doing, let's say, front squats of, 4 sets, you may do like we do the 2 to 3 with an AMRAP. So do your warm-up sets, do 1 set. Your second set may just be as many reps as you can do. You're done with that exercise, move on to the next thing.
Yeah.
So I like to keep the intensity there, but just slash a whole bunch of volume away, because that still gives us a marker and progress to the thing that you're training for. Where I've done this experiment before where I've had people just take a week off in general, don't do anything, just go walk. One, most people don't do it who like training. Two, you can potentially end up with some of Tim Gabbard's stuff, which is called a load spike, meaning you went from a pretty high level of volume to flat out nothing. And then now your soft tissue may not be prepared for that as you come back, just because you had that whole time of like no loading at all. Sure. So I tend to like to just scale the loading back. And then most people, I'll program like a 6 to 8 week cycle. For myself, like I don't really ever program any formal deloads or tapers anymore, to be honest. I just auto-regulate on a daily basis, and my travel schedule will tend to do that for me anyway. Right. So I'll just have a few days to take off here and there. So it varies a lot. And I think, like you said, looking for indicators of performance. If you were to highly simplify, I look at, okay, what are metrics of performance that are easy to calculate? Maybe you've got an aerobic performance, maybe you've got your weight training performance, and then what is your cost indicator? So just like the tachometer on your car, I can get it to go faster, but if I'm redlining it all the time, there's going to be an upcoming cost associated with that. It's fine to redline it once in a while, as long as I'm not living in that state. So for me, I tend to use heart rate variability as a good marker of the cost of everything that's going into that performance and that output.
Yeah. All great stuff. And we used to do 6 to 8 weeks. I guess I've lost that privilege. I'm now being relegated to the 4 to 5 week cycle, but hopefully I can work my way back there. Yeah. Mike, what else? Anything else that you want to leave people with? And also, I know you have a lot going online. You have a number of courses. So any closing thoughts? And then where would you want people to try to connect with you online?
Yeah. I would say my next closing thought would be, so someone like yourself, right? The next logical question is, okay, great. So I'm doing all this stuff. Like how can I get better? Right. So I'm at, relegated, right, to the 4 to 5 week. Are there things I could do to get back to 6 to 8 weeks? Right. So one, figuring out those days where it's there or it's not there, and figuring out on the days it's there, push a little more. On the days it's not there, just get kind of the minimum in, get to the next day. Because what I've noticed with people, even when everything is good, you still have like 20% of those days are either good or not there at all. 80% is just Dan John, punch the clock, get in there, get your work done, do the high quality work, worry about the next day. After that, the next question is, okay, are there other things I can do in the background to increase my ability to quote unquote recover, be more anti-fragile? My bias is looking at what homeostatic regulators you have to maintain, right? Which you're already doing. So one would be temperature, maybe some cold exposure, some sauna. Two would be pH changes. So some high intensity work that's true high intensity, some low intensity work, which you're already doing. Three would be at some point playing around with the end of the fuel system. So high carbohydrates, and then maybe periods of fasting or even ketosis temporarily, just to expand that metabolic spectrum. The last one would be regulation of carbon dioxide and oxygen. Would be some breathing techniques, breath hold, cadence work during zone 2 work. We did from Brian McKenzie, the exhale breath test. That gives you an idea of CO2 tolerance. So if you're better able to manage oxygen and CO2, then I think all 4 of those areas, those would be kind of like the physiology of what would be kind of the next level, or what I call flexible physiology or physiologic flexibility.
Awesome. No, it sounds like I have some homework to look forward to. And where can people track you down online?
Yeah, so best place is the main website. It's just miketnelson.com. We've got a bunch of opt-ins there where you can get onto the newsletter. Most of the information I send out, probably 90%, is through the newsletter. So hop on there. You can also just hit reply and we'll send you a cool free gift. And then we also have the podcast, which is the Flex Diet Podcast. Instagram, Dr. Mike T. Nelson. And then we do have the Flex Diet certification and the Physiologic Flexibility certification also.
Sweet. Well, guys, again, check out Mike's work. He's been a friend, someone who's been really helpful to steer me on course and course correct me when I veer off. And just someone who you can probably tell is very well versed in the science. And that's so important, I think, in any field, especially this one, because there's a lot of kind of guru-dom and influencer sort of, malarkey out there. So Mike, thanks for coming on. Appreciate you and everything that you do.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. Always good to chat.